Colonize This. It's beautiful, and if you haven't read the first edition, I'm sure the second edition is even better. Our two guests don't really need an introduction, but I'm going to go ahead and give them both one. And I'll start with our interviewer, and then pass Steve, do the introduction for our interviewee. Our interviewer is Chaitali Sen. Chaitali is a writer and educator based in Austin. She is the author of the novel The Pathless Sky and numerous stories and essays which have appeared or are forthcoming in Catapult, Colorado Review, Ecotone, LitHub, Los Angeles Review of Books, and other journals. She is the founder of the interview series Borderless, Conversations on Art, Action, and Justice, which is here every month, and it's amazing, so you should come. Our special guest tonight is Daisy Hernández. Daisy is a co-editor of Colonize This, Young Women of Color on Today's Feminism, and the author of A Cup of Water Under My Bed, a memoir. She is a former editor of ColorLines magazine and has written for National Geographic, The Atlantic, The New York Times, and NPR's All Things Considered. Oh. She teaches creative writing at Miami University in Ohio. Welcome.
Okay, welcome everybody. I'm actually just going to read I'm sure this book needs no introduction, but I'm going to read a description of it, and then Daisy's going to read from the intro. So, newly revised and updated, this landmark anthology offers gripping portraits of American life as seen through the eyes of young women of color. It has been decades since women of color first turned feminism upside down, exposing the feminist movement as exclusive white and unaware of the concerns and issues of women of color from around the globe. Since then, key social movements have risen, including Black Lives Matter, transgender rights, and the activism of young undocumented students. Social media has also changed how feminism reaches young women of color, generating connections in all corners of the country. And yet we remain a country divided by race and gender. Now a new generation of outspoken women of color offer a much needed fresh dimension to the shape of feminism of the future. In Colonize This, Daisy Hernández and Bushra Rahman have collected a diverse, lively group of emerging writers who speak to the strength of community and the influence of color, to borders and divisions, and to the critical issues that need to be addressed to finally reach an era of racial freedom. With prescient and intimate writing, Colonize This will reach the hearts and minds of readers who care about the experience of being a woman of color and about establishing a culture that fosters freedom and agency for women of all races. So, one thing that I will say about this book is I just got this edition a couple of days ago, and I haven't been able to put it down. It's very gripping. So, and actually, before you read from the intro, I'm wondering how many people here have read the first edition?
Okay. Well, this is exciting. You're new to it. Thank you so much, and thank you to the bookstore for hosting us, and thank you for coming out tonight. I think my introduction is pretty short, so I think if you'll indulge, I'll read all of it. And we did, and maybe we can talk about that later, but we did make a decision to also keep the first edition came out in 2002, so we made a decision to keep the introduction from that original edition, as well as the foreword from Sheri Moraga, feminist, Chicana icon, if you don't know her work, she's amazing. But so this is my intro, and my co-editor wrote her own intro, which is really great as well. I became a feminist because of an index card. It was my junior year of college, and I found myself one afternoon in a room at the student center that had a very low ceiling and thin carpeting. I had shown up not because the event was organized by the Feminist Collective, but because it had been advertised as a workshop about sexuality. Being the daughter of Cuban and Colombian immigrants who had worked in factories, I thought of sex as taboo. Now here was the word on a flyer like an invitation. That is how I ended up sitting in a stiff chair in a circle of mostly white girls, all of us with index cards and pens in our hands. On one side of the card, we noted our best sexual encounters, and on the back, our worst. We were giddy, pensive, nervous. We glanced at each other, then at the cards. Some of us wrote too quickly, others tapped the edges of the cards. I already knew my answer. I wrote swiftly. The moderator collected the cards and began reading aloud from them. They were anonymous, of course, and she read the good ones first. Multiple orgasms, the pleasures of receiving oral sex, hearing "I love you" after sex. I grinned like I knew what that was all about. But in reality, I had only heard or read about those sexual joys in Cosmo. Here, though, were real women at my age, confirming that sex could be good. Then the moderator flipped the index cards and began reading the other side. Out came short lines about the boyfriend who would not take no for an answer, the friend who demanded sex, the family member who forced himself. We fell silent. I fell silent. I don't remember now whether I wrote about the family member who had molested me as a child, but I do remember thinking it wasn't just us. Us was me and the girls I had known over the years who had also been abused. I had thought sexual violence only happened to me and my friends. I had thought it had to do with the way we looked, the length of our legs, our dark hair. Now here was a stack of index cards from girls I had never met before, and the index cards were telling me that my experiences as a Latina girl in one corner of New Jersey belonged to a much larger story of violence against mujeres. Later, I learned that in the early 1970s, the writer Jane O'Reilly had called this the click, that moment when you realize that what happens to you because you're a woman is happening to other women too. A new awareness snaps into place. I was ready to call myself a feminist. There was only one problem: my father. When I was in my early 20s, academics were theorizing about the voice of the teenage girl, how it develops and how she loses it. But for as long as I could remember, I had used my girl voice to speak for my Cuban father, who was only fluent in Spanish. I interpreted for him at the factory where he worked and also at unemployment agencies and at the banks. It didn't matter whether I was 12 or 22, I was Papi's voice. At home, he terrorized me and the women in our family with his rage and alcohol abuse, but out in the world, he relied on me. Feminism for me had to address not only my experiences of gender, but also of race, multilingualism, citizenship, class, and diaspora. By the time I left college and was harboring crushes on women and gender non-conforming people, I realized that feminism had to also be about queerness. Was that a tall order? I didn't think so. It was my life and the lives of the women I knew. After college, I discovered that Black feminist Barbara Smith, for example, had been arguing since the 70s that feminism had to tackle how Black women experience gender in combination with race and class. Smith and her feminist comadres penned this argument in the now famous Combahee River collective statement. And in 1980, Gloria Anzaldúa and Sherry Moraga published the anthology This Bridge Called My Back, bringing together women of color to talk about feminism, raza y más. In that book, Sherry wrote exactly what I was thinking about 2 decades later. I want a movement that helps me make sense of the trip from Watertown to Roxbury, from white to black. I love women the entire way, beyond a doubt. I too needed a feminism that helped me make sense of the bus rides I took between my publishing job in Manhattan and my Latina neighborhood in Jersey, between my Chicana mixed-race girlfriend in the Bronx and my Colombian mother in New Jersey. My experience with sexual abuse, racism, and classism was part of a larger narrative, but so too was my desire for a more expansive understanding of feminism. Again, I was not La Única. My own writing and thinking belonged to a feminist of color tradition that exists in politics, scholarship, and the arts. When my co-editor Bushra and I began working on the first edition of this book, mainstream media outlets were not using the word intersectionality, a term in theory Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw created in the 80s to identify how Black women face institutional practices that recognize gender or race bias, but not where those two meet. Today, the word intersectionality is all over social media and in national newspapers. The contributors from the first edition of Colonize This have been part of that change. Since the publication of the 2002 edition, they have gone on to lead community organizations that create new scholarship about and by women of color. They have taken their feminism into their work inside and outside of government. They have served as doctors, penned their own books, and made films. They have led the way, in other words, by doing. History, however, does repeat itself. We produced the first edition of this book in the wake of the terrorist attacks of September 11th, when police, government officials, and the entire country, it seemed, were racially profiling brown, Arab, and Muslim men and women. More than 15 years later, we worked on the second edition of this book in the wake of the 2016 presidential election and the ban on people traveling to the U.S. from 5 Muslim countries. My father yelled at me over the phone to not protest against the white man in the White House, even though that man admitted to being a sexual predator and had openly supported white supremacists. I'm going to the protest, I told Papi over the phone. I bought cardboard and made signs. I called my Republican senator and left messages. I grabbed the bullhorn at the march downtown, and I worked on this book. This second edition of Colonize This is for me a protest to the current political regime in our country. It is a response to the deportations of immigrant families, to the relentless killings of Black people by police officers, and to the media outlets that describe the abuse of girls by old white men as sexual encounters. This book, being as it is a gathering of young women of color sharing their experiences and intellectual insights, stands in defiance of what is happening in the courts in Washington and on the streets of our country. That said, this new edition did not begin as a protest. Initially, Bushra and I had wanted to see the stories from young women of color who have been at the forefront of key social justice movements for the past decade. From Black Lives Matter and trans visibility to organizing undocumented families and protesting at Standing Rock, young women of color have been working hard for a more socially just world. They have been creating new terminology, hashtag #MeToo, Black Lives Matter, UndocuQueer. I was hungry to read the stories of these young women of color. What does feminism look like for young women of color who grew up with the first Black president, with a visible transgender movement, with social media platforms? Bushra and I set out to find 9 young women who could answer these questions and join the voices from the first edition. This new edition has essays about working as an abortion doula, handling call-out culture online as a trans Latina, and being catapulted into the spotlight after suing a high-profile university for failing to protect women from sexual assault on campus. The new essays address being undocumented and an artist, coming of age with Michelle Obama and Disney movies, and what happens when gun violence takes your big sister. And the hashtag Say Her Name is not only a hashtag and a movement, but your day-to-day life. These young women of color are leveraging social media to their advantage. They are using it to organize and to break silence, and also to learn about feminism and redefine it. They have grown up in a more multiracial United States with faster access to the work of feminists of color, and as a result, they are articulating an intersectional feminism that is rooted in the work of the women who have come before us. It is also equally true that institutional barriers, from lack of daycare when you're a teen mom to the war on Black families, persist in the lives of young women of color today. One contributor asked, "And you're doing this new edition with your original co-editor?" Yes. In a world where women of color are so often pitted against each other and where social media makes bruising each other all too easily, Bushra and I have been blessed. No, actually that makes it sound like we got lucky. The truth is we worked hard at staying connected over the years, even as we published and promoted our own books, as she became a mother and I moved too many times around the country. We also worked hard and intentionally making room for each other's perspectives, trusting that talking it through would create a better book in the end. And I believe we've succeeded a second time. A final thought. Working on this new edition has affirmed for me the importance of focusing on what is happening in our communities of color and on being the ones who tell our stories. As Sonia Gunyasaka writes in her essay for this book about undocumented youth, we did the work to claim our lives. This, I believe, is the way forward. We have to claim our lives and claim our stories. There is no substitute for the power that comes from doing so. It is energizing and empowering, and ultimately, it makes everything else possible. Thanks for listening.
So your co-editor, Bushra, and I actually came up in New York together.
The world is small.
We became writers together in New York, so it's very nice to meet you finally.
Closing the circle.
So these are 9 essays that are overlaid with the essays from the first edition, and I was interested in one, how you found these 9 writers, and I noticed in the book that you can't actually tell. It doesn't say anywhere that this is from the new edition, and it's all very interwoven, which I really love. You can figure it out a lot of times from the context of the essay. So can you talk a little bit about that decision?
Yeah, it was a really different process. The first edition in 2002, we had done an open call, and we received essays from more than 200 women across the country, and from Canada too, actually. And then we took that and chose 28. And so this was a completely different process because we initially sat down. It was similar to the first time in that we sat down to brainstorm what topics we wanted for the new edition, which is something we did with the first one. And so we knew that we wanted something on organizing undocumented families, and we knew that we wanted more essays by trans women. We also knew that we wanted to specifically invite women who were around 30 and under, that kind of ballpark, so that it would feel more in conversation. We were in our 20s when we did this, so we wanted to make sure that that was true as well. And then there were several women that we had just met, both Bushra and I had met over the years. And so Andrea Pino, who was one of the women who sued the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, around sexual assault, and was just an incredible activist. We knew we wanted her to write an essay about that. Jamila King, who's an incredible journalist, I think still in New York City. We knew we wanted her to write for the book. So it was a combination of topics, and then people that we already knew, and then sometimes the writers found us, although they didn't know that they were looking for us or that we were looking for them. So Bushra was teaching in New York City, and one of her students came up to her after class and was talking to her about wanting to write about reproductive rights, and was sharing about how she's an abortion doula. And Bushra immediately called me up. What do you think of that? I was like, we didn't know we were looking for an abortion doula. And so it was incredible. Actually, it happened very easily and organically. It was a pretty incredible process. It was similar to the first edition. So I don't know how familiar you are with anthologies, but a lot of times when someone puts together an anthology, they get submissions and there's very little editing involved. You send it in and it usually, there might be some copy editing, but it kind of gets published in the way that it is. Usually, that's sort of been my own experience. Our experience was really different in that we really worked with every writer. So Bushra worked with one set of those 9 writers, and I worked with the other set. And so it was a lot of telephone conversations and emails, and not because the pieces were not fabulous in first drafts, but simply because we can always make the story even better. And sometimes, especially I think for women of color, there'll be a little hesitation in how much to share. Sometimes even, I know with one writer, we also, we talked about feeling the need to perform our story on the page, And so I remember saying to her, you don't have to actually include that part of your story if you don't want to. You actually get to make a decision what's on the page. And so there were a lot of telephone conversations, email. So it was a pretty incredible, and it was so nourishing. I can't tell you how nourishing it was for me to work on this. We pretty much were working on it, started just a few months after the presidential election. So I needed to put my energy in a place. And this was a very nourishing place to put that energy.
Edited again for this?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm so excited that you couldn't necessarily, so we made a decision to not label the new ones as new ones. Partly because we felt that there was so much conversation with the initial essays, and that they were in conversation, and we wanted it to feel that way for the reader. What we did do with the first edition, where there were some places where we thought, we need to just update it a little bit. So there's one essay about gentrification, and I won't remember the figure, but it was something like, it was, 15 or 17 years ago, it was astonishing that a martini was costing $8, and I don't know what martinis are costing now, but they're costing more than $8. And so there were sort of some small, I know we had a reference in another essay to some high fashion models, and so we just added another name, little things like that. But it was actually we didn't want to change. We didn't want to go through the process of changing the original, because many of the women who were in the first edition were also in their 20s. For a lot of them, it was the first essay that they were publishing. And I'll say this to those of you in your 20s, looking around the room, your voice is so particular in your 20s. It's so distinct, and go with it, embrace that. And so we thought, I knew that even with our introduction, if we went back and tried to update it or change it, your voice is just so different 15 and 17 years. You've lived a different life, right? So we didn't want to change it for that reason.
No, I'm glad you made that decision. There's so much energy.
Yeah.
And I do think that women in their 20s have a very unique voice. I wanted to talk a little bit about Christina's essay, because Christina, and I don't actually know how to say her last name.
My guess.
Okay. Maybe. So she is actually an organizer here in Austin.
Amazing.
And wanted to be here, but had to be out of town, I think. So, but her essay is the title essay, Colonize. It's an amazing essay. So I wanted to hear a little bit from you about how you connected with her. What was she doing at the time that you found her many years ago?
So and Christina is just a huge activist now and a big name. And when we met her, we didn't know her actually. She was someone who saw the call for submission, and I know this will be hard for some of you to imagine, but it was this life before social media, and it was very word of mouth. Like when we sent the first call out for submissions for the first book, it was on email. It was us calling people, hey, do you know anyone? It was us mailing flyers and saying, can you put this up in your city? And I actually haven't had a chance to ask her how she came in contact with it, but she just sent us her essay, and her voice, if you read her essay, her voice is incredible on the page, and she is blunt and honest and speaking to such an incredible intersectionality of race and gender within her own family and her own family dynamics. So we didn't know her at all, actually, and then we were struggling to it's very hard to come up with a title for an anthology, and at one point as we were struggling and we were on the phone, my co-editor and I still remember I was in a Walgreens in South Florida, walking down the aisles, and and then we started thinking about could we take the title of an essay, and hers immediately spoke to us because it's bold, it's in your face, it's unapologetic, and we thought, we basically were thinking how many essays can fall under this title, and we thought, okay, this is perfect. This says a lot of what we want to say.
That's amazing. I love the part in your intro where you're talking about what all these women have done in the years since they've written these essays.
Yeah, it was not a requirement to go and have an amazing life, but a lot of them just have, you can tell one way to identify, who was in the first edition is by looking at their bios. If they're a professor now, they were in that first edition. If they started a statewide organization in Texas, they were in the first edition. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Yeah.
Well, so this may be a dumb question. I was reading or listening to somebody who does podcasts, and this person was saying one of the jobs of the interviewer is to ask the dumb questions. So why young women of color? What was it about the youth that was?
Well, so the way this book began actually is an editor at Seal. Seal Press used to be a small independent women's press, and they approached me actually back in 2002, and they said, we want to do a book that's like This Bridge Called My Back. And for those of you who have never come across This Bridge Called My Back, go out and get your copy. Or actually, you don't have to go out, you're at a bookstore. Get your copy of This Bridge Called My Back. But that was a very, very seminal book about feminism and women of color. And so this editor was saying, do you want to do a book like that, but for our generation, basically? And I said, yes. Note to self, always say yes when people ask you if you want to do something like that. And it was young because we were so at the time I think I was 24. We were like 24, something like that. And what was funny was that it was the publisher who said, oh, young women of color, but we didn't know anyone who was not young person at the time. And in our original call for submission, we didn't specify an age because I mean this sincerely, it never occurred to us at 24 that anyone at 30 would think they were young. We were just like, like who thinks they're young when they're 30? I mean, we thought 30 was like, whoa, once you reach 30, I mean, you're a grown up. What?
It's like just over the horizon.
Yeah, it's just like, it's all smooth sailing after, we had such fantasies about 30. It was a big deal. And so we actually never specified it necessarily, but I would say now, so I don't think I would have necessarily said this one the first edition. Maybe I would have, I'm not sure. What did I say when I was 25? But I think now for us with that first edition, we did want to talk about, we were the generation that came up with women's studies being institutionalized, right? It's like the generation before us fought for that to actually get into a college classroom, right? So we thought, okay, we have something specific to say. We grew up with this. And now, so many years later, I still now I look back and I think, oh gosh, yes, when you're in your 20s, you have just this very specific kind of energy. that changes, you know, just becomes something different. So I wanted to have that energy, but I also felt like, I mean, this is a generation of young women of color who grew up with came of age during Obama and the Obama administration, came of age with Black Lives Matter, have been at the forefront of all these social justice movements, and I'm like, wild things have happened in the last 15 years. A lot of really great work has happened. So I felt like, what will it be like to have those 9 women join the first?
Yeah. So I would like to open it up for questions in a little bit. I have maybe 2 more questions.
Yeah.
But so you had this. You did talk about this a little bit, but there are 2 political moments that both editions came up in, was 9/11 and the election of Trump. And it's interesting that you said that this didn't start necessarily as a protest, but it became that. And I mean, this is a question that's definitely on my mind a lot right now as a writer. You know, what does it mean for literature to be protest? And did you? Is this? It sounds like this was a change from how you saw it in the first edition. I don't know if that's true, but maybe we can just. I mean, this may be even a good thing for the audience to weigh in on, like what is the, you know, how do we? I really believe that, and I think it's like this whole journey of this book actually proves this, that writing has profound influence on the world. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what it means for you to frame it at some point as a protest.
Yeah, well, it's strange because the first edition also did not start out as a protest. I mean, we started working on the first edition before 9/11. When 9/11 happened, we were kind of in the middle of working with the writers on their essays, and we did seriously think, like, do we continue with this book? There's so much that needs to be done out on the street, and we decided to continue because we felt like books have been so critical to both of us, you know, for both of our lives, and so we felt like this book could possibly last beyond this horrible moment, and it has, and it's been incredible to meet people of all sorts of backgrounds who have said, oh, this book kept me sane, this book helped me to feel less alone, this book became like kind of family for me, you know, helped me through a really hard time in my life, made things possible. Like, I feel like I've met people who've told me that they've reconciled with their moms after reading Colonize this. They changed one person changed her major from math to women's studies, which I'm not sure how I felt about that, but it was great. I mean, just sort of all these sort of changes have happened in people's lives as a result of reading the book, which gave me a lot of encouragement working on this book. And it was strange how it repeated, because again, we started this before the election of Trump. We thought this book was going to be coming out during the Hillary administration. It's like, whoa. And I think it is a protest, but I think it's also a protest in that it gives nourishment, you know, and it gives you sustenance to go forward. And I felt really, on a personal level, incredibly empowered just working with the women on this book. So yeah, I think it's here for the long haul. You know, even as sort of the chaos of the world, you know, continues and changes shape and form.
I mean, I learned so much from reading it too. I remember in college reading this Bridge on My Back, and it was the first time I was like, oh wow, maybe I matter. Like,
yeah,
I had always felt so inconsequential as a little, you know, girl of color.
That's a really powerful point, I think, in terms of being both a protest and an affirmation. Is like books can remind us, like, oh, I have significance here. Like, I'm important to the conversation. I'm part of the conversation.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience or comments.
So I heard that you've written for a lot of mainstream outlets. I'm also a journalist, so I wanted to ask, how is it for you as a Latino to go into these mainstream outlets?
How is it to go into these mainstream outlets?
Yeah, like what are the oppositions that you face?
Yeah, so many. It really depends on what your relationship is with the mainstream outlet. So when I was at the New York Times for a year, where I was there, you know, like in-house, so to speak, I would say that was a lot harder because you're sort of with this group of people from very early in the morning till very late at night sometimes. So I think you end up you just end up hearing a lot more of the difficulties. You end up hearing much more racialized language, and I think you would be as a freelancer, as someone who's outside of the institution. Just by virtue of being inside, you get to see a little bit about how the beast operates, you know, and so that can be very discouraging because change moves really slowly. It happens, it just goes really slowly. So I found that harder. I think that's also my temperament as well. I have incredible friends who have stayed inside of those media institutions and done really, really well. I think it kind of works out with what their personality is. I work better with like little bits at a time. So being in a more freelancer position is a lot easier. It's a lot of patience and staying aware of who your allies are, and over time becoming more clear about who your allies are, and that kind of just takes time, you know, and there's sort of ups and downs, you know, you make mistakes about who your allies are and they're not, you know.
I was going to ask you if you could help me because they have a segment where you can pitch as a physical writer.
I'm sorry?
If you still have connections there, if you could help me get it.
Yeah, let's connect afterwards. Yeah. Yeah.
Question. As somebody who recently got involved in anthology making,
Ooh.
what's like a piece of advice you would wish you could like go back and give yourself the first time you started going after an anthology?
Oh, that's a long list of advice. I mean, I would have told my younger self probably, like, accept that it is a complete labor of love. There will never be, it's not even about the financial compensation, there's just, you know, you're gonna lose some sleep. There's gonna be sort of long nights and deadlines. I would say, depends, are you doing a solo, like on your own as an anthology, or with a co-editor, or with a group?
Co-editor.
Yeah. So I feel like nourishing that relationship is probably one of the most important aspects of anthology making, actually. Like, as I was reading from this, sort of making room for each other's perspectives, not Xing each other's ideas out, you know, just like allowing there to be possibility that what you thought was not going to work, and that her idea or the other person's idea might be really fabulous. And I mean, I don't know if I would recommend this again. I guess I do now that I'm thinking about it. But when we did the first edition, and I probably would have told myself, you have more leverage with the publisher than you think you have, because they put us on a very tight deadline. And so I was cat sitting, I think, for someone. And so my co-editor Bushra came over, and we had this like crazy long weekend where we like did not leave the apartment. It was like the two of us and the cat and like a lot of chocolate chip cookies. And we were working with the editors, working with the writers like round the clock. And then it was fantastic for us that we were together in person for that long weekend, because there's no substitute for face-to-face, you know? And even now I would say like video over texting and cell phone conference, because there's just sort of no substitute for, like, you know, you can just read that eyebrow. There's just no substitute for that. So it was pretty fantastic. But yeah, I think nourishing that relationship.
Thank you.
Are you a part of any community of writers, or how do you nourish your writing practice and foster relationships with other writers?
I'm at the Macondo Writers Workshop right now, which is in San Antonio, which is the reason I'm here, is because I drove up this morning. So actually I chose to do that. The last time I was at Macondo was about 10 years ago, and I made some really incredible friends through that. The trick with going to any kind of writers workshop is connecting with people and then continuing your relationships with them beyond that one space, especially as a woman of color, because, you know, depending on where, you're all living in Austin, so this is a great city, but depending on where you live, you don't necessarily always have those connections. But yeah, I've signed up for things like that. Like they have a self-residency as part of the workshop, so it's not even just taking a class, but it's being able to go there and do your own work. And I know some people might be like, oh, but you can do your own work at home. But I'm gonna talk with people at the seminars, and I'm gonna talk with people at the readings and establish relationships that way. I went to Bona for several years. That's a Writers of Color workshop that is now moving, I think, around the country. That's a much more complicated space if you know the history of Bona. I won't go into all of it, but that was a really important space for me. And I do go to AWP, which is the Big Writers Conference, which will be happening in San Antonio in March, I want to say. So all of you should be getting down there. So it's about like, I don't know, like 15,000 people attend now. It's an incredibly large conference, but it's pretty fabulous for meeting people. And I mean, it's just like, everybody there's a writer or a book nerd, you know? It's a fabulous space. But a lot of it is also, for me, has been over the years exchanging work, like, you know, asking people, you know, would you be willing to swap manuscripts or a chapter or an essay and reading for one another? And, you know, as people give you feedback, it helps you decide, you know, do I want to, you know, does this connection make sense?
And you taught at Hedgebrook recently, right?
I did. Your sister, essentially. It's a small world. Yeah, and Hedgebrook I do recommend for all women in the room. Hedgebrook Writers Residency. It's outside of Seattle, and it is. There's a lot of writing residencies out there, and a residency is basically you get to go and work, do your creative work for. It can be a few weeks usually, and they will feed you and house you. Usually they don't pay for transportation. You should get yourself. That's the tricky part. But Hedgebrook is like the best experience for a woman writer. You get your own cottage. It was built for women writers, so I like the attention to detail. Like, I don't know, the desk is the right shape. You know, there's like the right windows. I don't know how else to describe it, but it's a pretty incredible space. And I went to Hedgebrook like a bazillion years ago, 20 years ago, and I'm still really good friends from some of the women that I met there. They were just, yeah.
And this is your memoir, A Cup of Water Under My Bed. If you have not read it yet, you can buy it here too. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on now?
I'm working on a book that I hope to come back to Texas with. It's called In Search of the Kissing Bug. Do people know kissing bugs? Here, they are these, not to gross you out, so if you have a phobia about bugs, here it comes. There are these insects that look like beetles, and Texas has a lot of diversity. I think it has 9 or 11 species of this insect. It has the capacity to carry a parasite that can be pretty deadly, and so it's called the kissing bug disease. The medical name is Chagas disease, and Chagas disease exists all over the Americas. It's more so found in South America, Central, and Mexico. But I had an auntie who was diagnosed with the kissing bug disease and died from it after many, many years. It's a bit more like Lyme disease. I don't want to completely equate it, but it can be a bit like that. And so I became obsessed with this parasitic disease that mostly in the U.S. affects immigrant families, and that we don't know about it. So I kind of set out to find other families like mine. And then I don't have a background in medicine or science. Do not let that deter you. You too can learn very quickly about things you never thought you would be interested in. And so yes, I got like a crash course in cardiology because the parasite will attack the heart mostly. Kind of can turn the heart into Swiss cheese, how one doctor described it. And so yeah, it's sort of about my journey. And that's coming out with Tin House Books, hopefully either next year or the year after.
Are there any other questions or thoughts from the audience?
Burning desires.
So, you have
I was just going to ask how you balance working on your writing and talking about your writing in events like this.
Oh, that's a good
a
question.
day job. Do you hate the question? What you're working on now?
No. But the balancing, you know, it's a lot of planning, I guess, is what it is now. So I just spent 2 very intense months working on the second draft of the book. So I'm excited to talk to all of you. I haven't been talking to anyone. So it's sort of, I did kind of a stay-at-home residency. So because I knew, right? I knew sort of like May and June were going to be these really good months to settle into it. And it's honoring that when you do have the time to talk about the work, that you really enjoyed that part of it too. Like when my memoir came out at the end of 2014, it was just like many, many months of just talking to everyone about that. And it's like, oh, right. And then when you're in it, you feel like, wow, this is never going to be over. I will never stop talking about this book ever. But then it's like, oh no, right, it comes to an end and you're like in your next project. Is that true for you, like in terms of balancing your writing and talking about what you're writing?
I don't do much talking about the writing and not as much writing as I would like to either. So a challenge I look forward to.
I understand. Thank you.
I'm like really interested in hearing your thoughts on getting MFAs or like going to writing school or creative. Wow, words are escaping me. To do creative writing.
Yeah.
Because it's something I internally struggle with, knowing my experiences in the institution. And I definitely don't want the institution to like strip me of my natural ability to tell a story or my voice, you know? But at the same time, I feel like women of color, especially like Black and Indigenous women, I feel like need those letters behind their name for people to listen or for them to access certain spaces. So I would love to hear like what are your thoughts? Do you believe in that institution?
I'm a fan of the MFA program.
Yeah.
I have an MFA disclosure. It's interesting because I actually tried to get an MFA in my early 20s, and I thankfully was rejected from the programs that I applied to. And I say thankfully because I don't think at 23 that it would have been a positive experience, especially in my case because I really wanted to write a memoir. And I wanted to write a memoir about growing up in an immigrant Latina family, coming out as bisexual to my parents, class mobility experiences. And so I think for what I was writing and the way that I was writing it as a memoir, it would not have been a good match. Like I don't think that the institutions at that point would have been supportive of what I was trying to do. I think it would have tried to get me in a different direction. So I did it in my late 30s, and it was a fabulous experience. But by then, kind of because of what you were asking, was I already had a community of writers, of friends, so I went in with a lot more confidence and a lot more sense of who I was, and I could call them when it got bad, you know. But I will say that I think whether you do it in your 20s or 30s or 60s or at any point, I think it is important to have a group of friends outside of the institution that already knew you before the institution, because they're the ones who are going to support you and carry you through that process. I also I made some decisions about choosing. I went to the University of Miami in South Florida, and there was a woman of color director whose politics I really respected, and she was bringing Cristina Garcia, who's an incredible novelist, to campus, and John Murillo, who's an Afro-Chicano poet, who's amazing. So I felt like I was really paying attention to what she was trying to do in that institution, and it was an incredible experience because of that. So even though I said no to another institution that was very prestigious, but that's in Iowa, and they have an amazing nonfiction program, but I just thought for where I was, emotionally and spiritually and creatively, that was going to be really difficult for me to be in Iowa. And so, yes, I think you can make decisions. And it all depends, too, on how mobile, if you're able to move to a different place. But yeah, I'm happy to talk with you beyond this event about MFA programs. So I keep actually reminding me, I keep wanting to write my guide to doing the MFA program without losing your mind. Because I think a lot of it is also what one of my wonderful mentors said to me when I was really overwhelmed with the course load. So they also have you teach. It's like, why are you teaching when you're a student at the same time? I will never know. But I do know why, because that's how the institution makes its money, right? But I remember calling this mentor and being like, I'm behind on my reading, I'm behind on this, and she said, and I was exhausted, like I needed to sleep, and I remember her saying, well, it's probably just not your time to finish reading that book for class. And I was like, oh, I can't, I'm like the nerdy straight A student, and I was like, oh my God, what if she's right? What if it's just not my time to finish reading this book? And I went to bed, and I had a great next day. So I really recommend, it might just not be your time to finish finish that paper. And you know what, it works out fine. It's a lot of is that, you know, especially as women of color, we put even more pressure on ourselves, right? It's not only, you know, it's been internalized deeply. And so a lot of it was like letting go of, I have to perform at 150% all the time. Yeah. So you had a question, Becca?
Yeah. I'm a high school teacher in El Paso, Texas, and I just wondered if you had any particular advice for encouraging young people to write. Like, you obviously work with young people that had gotten out of high school, but other than just being there to like listen and encourage them, do you have any particular advice for high schoolers who want to say something?
Yeah, I think what I noticed, at least, you know, and I do work with first-year college students, and what I noticed that what often opens the door is actually being introduced to literature that opens that door. So I think, you know, I was just talking with a friend, and I'm thinking about Sandra Cisneros because I'm at the Macondo Writers Workshop, and she founded the Macondo Writers Workshop over 20 years ago. And we were talking about how a house on Mango Street like speaks to so many people at so many different points in their lives. And so even teaching one chapter from that book, and what I do actually is I really believe in let's read the text and then let's try to do something. Let's try to do a piece of writing based on that text, you know? And it might just be the repetition that is in a piece, or it might be, okay, the red sweater in this particular chapter, what was an object, you know, from second grade that you remember, or from some childhood, you know, and it starts to open the door. So I think pairing the writing, I sound like such an English teacher, pairing the writing with the reading, but I think choosing text, you know, very intentionally. And I'm a big fan of like short, you know, especially for leading into writing assignments, you know, having short pieces, just, you know, a chapter from a book as opposed to like many chapters from the book or an entire book, making it very accessible in that sense too. I know for myself, if you read my memoir, it can be read as a series of collage essays, and I gravitate towards the short, but I think part of that too is it's less intimidating, you know, and it offers you the ability to also focus and say a lot in a short paragraph.
Daisy, thank you. Such a pleasure to talk to you. Please come up and ask questions, and I don't know, maybe you want to sign some books. But let's give